From Shine Cancer Support, this is
Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show.
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Hi, I'm Tatum, and there's so much information out there about working after cancer, but a lot of it is quite dry, quite boring, and presumes that you have an understanding line manager or an HR department that understands what reasonable adjustments are. That is why we have Julie Denning here today, because we're going to talk about real situations. You know, if you're looking for a new job, what if you have a gap on your resume? How do you explain it? And so Julie Denning is CEO of Working to Wellbeing. She knows a lot about this, and you've sent me your questions, so let's get to it.
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show.
So welcome, Julie.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me on the podcast today.
So tell me a bit about what it is that you do and your company.
At Working to Wellbeing, we help people with all sorts of different long-term conditions, help them to improve their functioning and their day-to-day activity, and help them to get back to work when they're ready. That's in essence what we do.
Amazing. And what is the best bit about your job?
The best bit is when someone says, you know what, Julie, it's really hard to say this, but actually, I just don't think I need you anymore. I don't know how to say this, but I don't need you anymore. Like, that's great. That means you're self-managing. That means you're back at work. That means your life is back on the track that you want it to be. This is great.
And how did you get into this line of work? Like, what's your background?
So I'm a chartered health psychologist. I'm also a CBT therapist, but I've spent a lot of time working in the space of functional restoration in persistent pain, supporting people with mental health to get back to work, and more recently supporting people with cancer. And when I say recently, I'm quite old, so I've been in this space for a really long time, for about 24 years or so, and Working to Wellbeing was started in 2012. So we've been supporting people with cancer to get back to work since then.
So I got questions. We have a closed Facebook group that people sent in questions on through WhatsApps, and also from a meeting that we had online. So around the topic of returning to work, there was a question about, when do you have a conversation with your employer, if you have an employer? And we are going to get to self-employed and looking for work as well. But if you do have an employer, who sets the time for when you go back? And what kind of conversation should you be having at the beginning of that?
In my world, it's have the conversation as early as you can, which is quite an intriguing one, because when's that? Well, for me, that's sort of a diagnosis, actually, because let's face it, probably at the point of diagnosis, a week or two or even a day before, you were working. And then suddenly you've got this diagnosis, you're thinking, what do I do next? And that, I think, is the time to start talking to work about it. And it's not about looking at your clock and going to look at the diary and go, oh, I think I'll be back in round about 9 months' time. Here we go. Let's put the date in the diary now. Yay. It's nothing like that. It's just about just getting the conversation going, saying, look, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to have to go for some tests. So I've been for some tests. So I've got more tests to come. This is the pathway I think I'm going to go through. I'd like to keep in touch with you. I'd rather not keep in touch with you, whatever it is in terms of work that you'd like to do. Have that conversation earlier, because we say to the folk that we work with, it's easier to kind of give a month's update than it is to give 6 months, 8 months, 9 months worth of an update. So if you can just kind of keep ticking along, maybe meeting your line manager fairly regularly and periodically, just to give them an update of where you're at and what's happening for you. And maybe you might want to find out about your colleagues, or you might want to have the newsletter sent to you, or some people want to work all the way through treatment. And that's important. So if you have started that conversation early and you are doing really well through treatment, it's not affecting you, then you could speak to your line manager and say, actually, I'd like to be at work, please. Whereas if you didn't have that conversation earlier on, you might be feeling well, but not know how to start the conversation. So I'd say as early as possible, but whenever you're ready, ultimately.
Yeah, and in those conversations, if you're talking about when you're coming back, there is this huge unknown, right? This huge uncertainty. I mean, I know for myself, for example, the first time work called me and said, would you like to come back? I laughed and then cried on the phone. I was like, I'm a liability. I will be underneath my desk I was like, I would do damage. One of the side effects that I had was I had developed sort of a stammer, like my brain function wasn't working. That's kind of clearer because I was like, there's absolutely no way. But I think where it starts to get really complicated is when you're like, oh, some days I'm kind of okay, but am I work okay? And can I sustain that okayness? And when you're navigating that uncertainty for the first time yourself, how do you begin to convey that to somebody else who may not understand anything about cancer or fatigue?
It starts at the very beginning, isn't it? I think is explaining this is what my week might look like, and kind of almost educating, for example, your line manager. This is what I experienced, because we get a lot of people say, my line manager said I look so well, but I just don't feel it. That's a really common thing that we hear, and there's lots of things that might still be ongoing. So for you described having a stammer and having your cognition affected. For other people, they experience like a fatigue, not a little bit of tiredness after a couple of nights, like cloak wearing, heavy, pulling the plug level of fatigue, but it can come and go, or it can be that low level and it can peak and it can trough. Other people report having pain, other people report having lots of mood variation, like you described. I mean, all in one call you were laughing and crying, but that kind of mood variation exists as well, and again that can fluctuate. So I think it's sort of sitting down with a cup of tea and just talking through what you're experiencing and what that could look like, and that hunch that you think, I think I could get back, starting the conversation of what that could look like, and really sort of helping your line manager to identify what you can and can't do, because they might make second guesses. Oh, they'll absolutely be able to do that, but then you won't be able to at all. So I think it's that education on both sides. Your line manager needs to know what you're experiencing, and you need to know what they're going through as well in terms of work and workload and where you might be able to fit in. So I hope that answers your question. That was a rather long-winded way, I think.
No, it was great. Just going back to that point of uncertainty, is just saying to them, I don't know, and bringing up the conversation of what if I do come back too soon and I need more time? Like, how do you say that sort of in a very professional way? Do you have anything
oh God,
that sort of
like the pressure?
Sorry,
the pressure's on. I think ultimately you can get words from people from all different places. I think it's about sort of saying, look, this is what I think I could do. And I think that uncertainty is okay. But I think maybe you're focusing on what you are able to do rather than what you can't do at this point in time might be useful. And it kind of, that goes back to our very first kind of question of when should I start talking? That's why we say start talking early, because you'd have had a lot of those conversations, and your line manager probably would have seen you through the ups and the downs one way or another. And you can say, I'm feeling, do you remember way back in, December last year, and I was feeling really foggy? Well, that's lifted now and I'm feeling so much clearer. Or do you remember I was saying to you, I was experiencing a lot of tingling in my fingers and having some manual dexterity issues? Well, that's so much better now, and I feel like I can type. It's so much better. So I think that ongoing conversation will help with it. Won't be so sudden of like, right, and here we are, and I've not seen you for 9 months, and we're going to sit down in a meeting and go through all these things. Yeah, do you know? Which you can do, absolutely. And then I'd advise something like a wellbeing action plan, which I can talk some more about if you want me to structure the conversation. But actually, just a dialogue as early on as possible will just smooth that pathway for the big conversation, the big return to work conversation.
I think one of the things that does come up, especially with Shine members, either because they are younger, this thing of, oh, well, you look great. Everything's all good now, right? So you can handle X, Y, and Z, or, I expect this done by this time. How, when you are presenting as looking okay, do you, again, convey, actually, I'd like to minimize my workload right now? I'm not as okay as I look?
Well, again, that's all part of the conversation, is saying it's lovely that you think I look well. That's good. But you need to also know that I'm not always feeling as well as I look. And I think that's actually an education piece across the board with people with long-term conditions. Those hidden long-term conditions, people just don't see it because they have their own vision of what someone with cancer should look like. Right. So, your archetypes of having no hair, or looking quite pallid, looking quite grey, like quite drawn, being very tired. And then you turn up in the office beautiful hair, looking really perky and with the program, and like, hang on a minute, the image that I have in my mind of what you should look like doesn't look like the person in front of me. Oh, you must be well. So I think there is that, again, your line manager is not going to be able to second guess what they can't see. So you're going to have to let them know, it's great you think I look well and I do feel well, but some days I really don't, and there is some stuff that I just want to tell you about and how that might impact on me at work.
Oh, I love the way that you said that. And if it's the other way round, if perhaps you have changed significantly, or you don't have hair, or there is now a really big shift, and maybe some people at work aren't even recognizing you, is it good to have some phrases ready to kind of feel prepared, not just for the work of work, but also for navigating those quite difficult conversations?
I would say definitely practice some one-liners of deflection, and often just sort of that throwaway, yes, I'm fine, thanks, but how about you? How have you been? We've not seen you for ages. That kind of turning the conversation around and putting it on the other person rather than having all the impact on you and your dialogue, and your story. But you could also get your line manager's support with that and ask them to smooth that pathway of saying, like, don't ask me too many questions because I really don't feel comfortable when those questions are being asked. So you can get some help. If you've still got colleagues at work and you've been in touch with them, maybe they could help you, pull in some support. Social support's really, really important. But otherwise, get some one-liners that you feel comfortable with, saying, I don't look as maybe you expected me. I do look really tired, but I've been through an awful lot. It's been a hell of a ride the last 9 months, and this is where I'm at the moment. And kind of rolling with it a little bit, so it doesn't become, it's a bigger deal as you want it to become, I guess, in that sense, of how you want to manage it. It's what you feel comfortable with ultimately.
And sometimes we talk about this with friendships, about having, kind of drawing in that one friend who's quite happy to communicate on your behalf, but actually kind of thinking about that in a work setting. If you do have that ally, you do have someone that can just be like, they're looking forward to coming back to work, but they kind of don't want to talk about it all the time. So actually, when they're back, don't feel like you need to ask them all the details about treatment. Enlisting what might help, and also understanding there can be that curiosity. But for some people, and definitely we hear this at Shine, it's actually a place where they sort of forget about everything for a little while, and actually that's quite nourishing for them. And then other people, going back to work is incredibly draining, and then they've got a lot less for the rest of their life. So it's also kind of thinking about, the aspects of work that are refueling, that you enjoy, and how you might want to navigate that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Some people find work a massive distraction, and it gives them something else to think about, because otherwise all they can think about is cancer and what they've been through. And work is kind of that very timely, I can just, be back to being me again. I don't have to be me with cancer. I can be in a different place and space with my thoughts. And it's distracting, hanging around with other people, and the social support side of things as well. That's all very, very powerful. But then there are other times when, work can really drain you. And I think it's maybe about doing some analysis or reflection of, if you do feel particularly tired after coming back to work one day, what was it about that day that was particularly awful? And it might be, I don't know, you had to have a very difficult conversation with someone and it was a really emotionally draining call or a meeting, or maybe there was a spreadsheet that you had to analyse and there were about 3 or 4 tabs open. You had to hop between tabs and it just suddenly became an absolute mire of numbers and you could no longer see straight. Or maybe, you were deep in words and you had to write a big report, and maybe there was a deadline associated with it. And it's kind of just looking and thinking and seeing which of those tasks do you find most draining and perhaps need to allow more time for. So, with cognitive tasks, or even emotional tasks, we often say, double the amount of time that you need to do it. So if it's a heavy going cognitive task, that spreadsheet I said with 4 tabs open, lots of stuff, data, give yourself double the amount of time and add a little bit on. Just give yourself more time to do that task. If you finish him sooner than that, then brilliant. You've won the gift of time. But otherwise, you've given yourself, so you're kind of managing the stress of it, and then managing the impact on you in terms of fatigue, for example. Or if you've got a really emotional call, give yourself 15 minutes before the call, 15 minutes after the call, so you can kind of get in the right space, be nice and prepared for it, go through it, and then know you've got the 15 minutes afterwards to go. Yeah. Before you go headlong into your next thing.
What I love...
Does that make sense?
Yeah, about what you said is it's a really compassionate reframing of it. And I think so many of us go into work and are like... Yeah. And feel guilty and feel... If something's taking a lot longer, might feel a bit inept, might feel not as valuable. There can be a real sense of it can be confidence draining. It can also feel like other people were relying on me. Actually, how you've just said that was, that's interesting. It was a particularly bad day. Here's a point of curiosity, thinking about what can be done. I just loved that reframing of it. And what do you think about that pressure that people put on themselves?
People do put a lot of pressure on themselves anyway, I think. And not everybody does. I think it's a question, again, noticing, are you the sort of person who does? And are you the sort of person who is often, prior to cancer, actually was someone who used to beat themselves up, used to be very hard on themselves, because we see that sort of amplified, I think, after an experience like cancer and all the treatments that you'd have to go through. So I think just notice, are you being particularly hard on yourself, and do you need to be? I always think there's enough people in the world who maybe want to bring you down. You don't need to be one of them. You can, look after yourself and make sure and I get people saying, but surely that's just letting myself off the hook. And it's like, well, what hook were you on? It's still about, taking responsibility for stuff. That just doesn't mean that you have to be horrible and hard to yourself in that process. It's about what's working best for you. So you help yourself in that process of getting back to work, rather than almost being a hindrance by going 100 miles an hour, or trying to be perfect, or trying to be all things to all people, or, trying to be exactly who you were before. Whereas now you're still that person, you're still that personality, but your body's been through a lot. Your mind's still processing, probably. Cut yourself some slack, and be kind to yourself. It's interesting. You notice it's reframing as compassion. We do a lot of that work, helping people to be kind to themselves. Yeah,
I mean, it's such a time that because it's more sustainable, actually, than the pushing technique. I mean, the pushing technique can work for a limited amount of time sometimes, but doesn't tend to be the most sustainable way of doing it. And actually, that kind of reframing. And like you said, either you've gotten a bit of extra time and maybe you didn't need it, and that can actually feel quite nice. But speaking of things that are actually hard, what if the workplace doesn't know about reasonable adjustments? What if they're not willing to make what is this incredibly vague term? And someone said, when they were asking this question, they were like, what is a reasonable adjustment? I mean, practically, what is it? I'd love to hear a really creative use of a reasonable adjustment.
I think that's a really interesting thing. Going back to your first questions, so there are many line managers out there, for example, who won't necessarily know what reasonable adjustments are or how to support someone with cancer, because although cancer prevalence is increasing and treatments are improving and therefore more people are back at work, actually it's still, in the scheme of things, not that many people. So people, having to learn. They're having to learn and understand. So I think there's some education that can go on. And there are various charities that you can point your line manager in the direction of, or even to HR internally and saying, this is some support that you need to get. But there's a different thing to not adhering to it. They're two different things for me. So if you do know and you don't adhere to it, that becomes almost a position. And I'm no lawyer as I say this, I would say, nor am I a HR person. The Equality Act does state that if a line manager or employer is aware of the person having had cancer, whether that be actually in the last 6 months or ever, it is a protected characteristic, and you need to be considering reasonable adjustments. And you're right, it's extremely grey, and it is deliberately so, because you've got to accommodate for all sorts of size of organisation, all types of organisation, all sorts of business that their imposing organisations are involved in, and the tasks that people have to do. So it is deliberately vague, but employer has to demonstrate they've done everything possible and reasonable to try and support that person to stay at work. And reasonable adjustments So the Equality Act protects cancer is a protected characteristic, and you are protected for as long as you're at work under the Equality Act.
I didn't know that you were always covered underneath it. So, saying that is and actually sort of clarifying that, I think, is really important, that, you could be looking for a job 5 years later or in a new place, but actually, you can still ask for a reasonable adjustment.
Yeah, you can. If what's happening to you and the symptoms you're experiencing or the situation you're in is impacting on your ability to do your job. One thing could be you could be having annual checkups. Mm-hmm. So you could have, had cancer 10 years ago, but you're still going through, for whatever reason, because of the severity or nature of your cancer, maybe it's a particularly rare one, you could be going for annual checkups, and that could take a day of testing, for example. So the reasonable adjustment would be allowing and enabling that person to take the time off work to be able to do that. It's a really interesting point about people that have had the diagnosis like a decade ago, for example, but there may be some flare-up of symptoms. They might be actually having a relapse of cancer, or it could be a symptom like brain fog, for example, could actually be lingering over a period of time, and it does flare up under certain stressful conditions, for example. So you need to be letting your employer know if that's the case. So although your cancer diagnosis was a really long time, actually you're still experiencing residual effects of that. And for the most part, you can cope really, really well. But there might be certain scenarios where you just don't, and that's where it's so important to be talking to your line manager about what you are experiencing. So you get the support you need to stay at work. But ordinarily, so say you have been someone who's had breast cancer and you have gone through sort of 6 months of chemotherapy, and you've had your month off, and then you've gone into radiotherapy, and you've had your 3 weeks or so of Monday to Friday radio. It always intrigues me what happens at the weekend. But you've had your radiotherapy and you're feeling much better, you've been given all clear, and you think you can get back to work, but you maybe are still experiencing some fatigue, maybe a little bit of pain, perhaps some brain fog still, but you feel that you've got the capability and capacity to return, then you would want to be setting a phased return to work plan up with your line manager, and making sure that is doable from both your perspective and the employer. That's where the reasonable part comes in, because sometimes businesses can't. I could make the most beautiful return to work plan and do a great VOC rehab job, vocational rehabilitation job on it, and it's awesome. But I could talk to the line manager and they go, I'm really sorry, but we can't do this, this and this for X, Y and Z reasons. So the return to work process has to be a dialogue and a conversation. Sometimes even it's not a negotiation in that sense, but it is certainly two parties coming together and discussing what's possible. Typical adjustments are looking at days of the week that you'd be in. So a lot of people, they might start going in on midweek, like Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday, and then having the longer weekends to recuperate. Other people might go in Monday, Wednesday, Friday and have days off in between. You have people who may start, if they have to go into the office, for example, or to the workplace, they may start later so they can miss the commute. So they don't have the fatigue of having, what could be actually a 20-minute journey, but during the rush hour, it's an hour. We've all been and experienced those ones, haven't we? And they're tiring. But if we can just shorten that duration of the commute, you can have different job tasks that go on. So there's often analysis of the job description, which is quite fascinating because people say, well, my job description was written 10 years ago. My job's evolved in the meantime. So again, it's a conversation between you and your line manager. What does your job entail? What were you doing? What could you do going forward? And increasing the intensity maybe of your workload and job role over a period of time as well. But sometimes we have people who, like if they're in manufacturing, for example, it's sort of more industrial setting where nobody they're like on the shop floor, for example, on the manufacturing floor, that they can't go back to that yet because maybe they're not physically capable, but they could maybe do a job in the back office. And I've had some line managers saying, they'd never want to do that. They're a hardened kind of tough man. They won't want to go and do an office job. Why would they want to do that kind of thing? And it's like, hang on, challenge your assumptions and judgments there, because I've been in scenarios where you've given the employee that opportunity, they've bitten your arm off and said, yes, please, I just want to get back to work. And that's a great way to start. So it's one top tip. I definitely say challenge any assumptions and judgments that are made. So, and the idea is to get almost as creative as you can in that process. It really can be a very creative process, the return to work one, because there's often changes that need to be made. So you've made this great plan, but actually as you're starting to operationalize it and live it, actually it doesn't always quite work. So you need to kind of revise it or pause it for a bit. If you're on week 2, 3, pause week 3 and go into that week 4, 5 are the same as you were in week 3, and then keep going until you feel ready to increase again. Or it could be actually that piece of project work that you've dusted down from the shelf that really needs to get done, actually that isn't suiting you because it is actually too cognitively demanding at this point in time. Let's not do that. So I think you sort of mentioned vulnerability earlier when we talked about compassion. I think it's working through and acknowledging and saying, no, that's actually too difficult for me. I gave it a go and tried it, but actually it's still not quite right. Can we alter? Can we refine? Can we be flexible? And the best return to work plans I've seen are the flexible ones.
Again, I really like the way that's how you've described it. I can hear everything is about this kind of relationship building, about this communication, both the curiosity, but also the creativity, checking in with what you need, but knowing that things can be flexible and adaptable. And I think that combination, when it works well, I can imagine being amazing. And when it doesn't work so well, when personalities involved are maybe not as understanding, or you can see how that could be challenging. And if people need to sometimes just talk about what they're handling and have a space, is that also kind of part of the work that you do, is how to move through it when it's sticky, when it's tough?
Definitely, and that's the work that a vocational rehabilitation practitioner will do. It's what we do in our company, is that we sort of, that metaphorical sort of hand holding, but it's partnership, kind of working with the individuals, saying, okay, well, how did that go? And that's, it was a really challenging week, and this happened and that happened and the other happened, but this went well and maybe this didn't so well. So we'll discuss it, and then we'll say, right, okay, well, so what can we do for the coming week? How can we problem solve to make that easier? You mentioned that it was quite difficult with your line manager. I remember once that the individual wasn't actually back at work, but it was a great example of like the two people were just on completely different pages. So the person was trying to get back, but they said, it's the most, I've been at this job for a really long time, and I don't understand my line manager. They're not getting in touch with me. I don't really understand what's happening here. And I'm beginning almost to get quite upset about it, almost a bit disenfranchised as well. Whereas they'd always been quite upbeat about going back to work, and they were getting really quite dismayed. And we're saying, well, look, let's just talk this through. I didn't have the opportunity to talk to the line manager, so we were hypothesising, what do you think's going on here? What could be the different options? They could hate you. We were on like global panic. Or they could hate me and don't want me to go back, or they could be wanting to make me redundant, or they may be, my job's at risk. Okay, so that's the scariest it could be. What other options could it be? Or they maybe just don't know how to have the conversation, or maybe if they were in your shoes, they wouldn't want to come back to work. They wouldn't want to hear from their line managers. They're acting out how they'd want to be treated. Or it could be that they just don't know how to have the conversation. They might feel they're pushing you to do something you don't want to do, or they just want to protect you and wrap you in cotton wool. There could be any number of reasons why this line manager hasn't contacted you. And through the conversation, she just pointed out and said, you know what's really interesting though? Whenever I contact them, they always come back immediately. And I was like, that's interesting. So why do you think that is? So we just kind of carried on this conversation. And I said, well, maybe it's just that if they're always replying to you immediately, maybe actually they do want to be in contact with you, but they're letting you lead. And they've made the assumption that that's what you want. So maybe we can go in with a different thing of saying, actually, this is what I need from you. I'm very happy that you contact me more regularly, not just in response to me. Can we maybe meet every week, and we can talk about how I'm feeling and get this return to work plan going? And I remember it being then ultimately one of the most successful return to work plans I had. The line manager, with the first day back, they went and met them in a local coffee shop, and they walked in together into the office. So to sort of soften that whole process and make it less scary for the employee. Often it is that not necessarily a breakdown in conversation or communication. It's about misperceptions. So one person holding one view and another person holding another, and them just not really having ever quite articulated it clearly to each other, so you can move forward together.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, it made me realise how alone sometimes you can feel at work or in a work situation, because you might have someone coming into your appointments with you, and actually when you're at work, it's like you, and your abilities, and to have someone to really be able to have those conversations with, actually, and thinking about that reframing, thinking about what the possibilities are, I can see that really making a difference. So if someone, because this also often happens, is people decide, well, actually, that job isn't really what I wanted to be doing. I want to do something brand new. One man in Shine, he was in his 20s and he was in an interview and it was all seemingly going well. And then the interviewer sort of leaned in and said, I have to ask, were you in prison? And he was like, what? And he goes, there's an 18-month gap in your resume. That person wasn't thinking, oh, they could have been sick. My personal feeling about this is I don't think it's anyone's business, whatever you were doing in a gap from your work. Like, I actually think that shouldn't even be a question. I think there's way too much that employers ask that they shouldn't be.
Yep,
but that's a me thing. How do you put it on a resume, or do you? What do you say? When do you say it? And does it matter if you don't do it in the right order, in the right place?
No, I don't think it matters at all. I think the most important thing is that you find a way to describe it that you feel comfortable with, that is true. Not that it's true to yourself and true to what happened and true to how much you want to disclose. So you've described there as, I don't want to disclose anything, and you don't have to. You're not obliged to, and the employer isn't obliged to ask you about any ill health, and inquire about it, and then make any judgments based on it. So they can only ask you those questions after they've offered you the position. And then it's good practice to ask, because then they need to be supporting you as an employee and making sure that you've got what you need to be at work. So it's entirely up to you what you disclose and how you disclose it and how you want to frame it. And finding the right words, and sometimes it helps to do that. You might want to ask, we affectionately call them Jerry, but ChatGPT, for example, to find some words that you can fill in that you feel comfortable with on your CV of how you want to describe that space and that gap. And an employer probably will ask you. What I find intriguing is they immediately thought they'd gone to jail. Yeah. And I'm wondering, is because it's a young person, would they have said that if it was an old person, or would they have thought actually older people more likely to be ill? Don't expect a young person to be ill. But that's judgments, that's assumptions that people are making. Much better to say, what were you doing between October and December, 18 months later? What was happening there? There seems to be a gap in your CV. And then you can say, I'd rather not talk about it, or this is what happened, or I had a cancer diagnosis and treatment, but I'm feeling really well now and I'm able to get back, and this is what I'm able to do, and this is what I've learned from that experience. And in the meantime, I was reading and keeping up with my CPD. So you can frame it however you want to, really. The important thing to know, though, is the moment an employer does know, so once they've given you the job and that offer has come through, is that if you do disclose at that point, again, it's your choice, you don't have to, but then they're obliged to help you. The moment they know, they have to consider reasonable adjustments and what's possible to help you. And if they don't know, they don't have to provide them. Because they didn't know. So I think it's useful to disclose when you're ready, and that's how you want to do it. It's your choice to do.
My personal feeling about interviews and jobs is it's quite similar to dating, in that if someone's going to be put off by the fact that you've been ill and they don't want to employ you because of it, then maybe they're not a great employer that you want to work for anyway. And a company that actually sees the value in you and the value of your experiences may be this could actually not be a negative, but could be a way that you're screening out who is an unscrupulous company and who maybe you wouldn't want that job anyway.
Completely agree with you. I think you find out a lot about the culture of the organisation and how they respond to that information that you provide. Yeah, I agree. And I think an interview should be dating. Interesting way to put it, but it is, isn't it? Because ultimately it's a relationship, and you want to join an organisation that sits with your values and it values you and wants you for your skill set. And if they're not going to do that, then that might actually somewhere down the line actually really stress you out because they're not aligned with you, they're not with you, they don't understand you.
Right.
So yeah, I think quit while you're ahead. You've got that almost inside scoop of like, no, let's leave. Where's the door? Because it's not the right organisation for me.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You know, that makes so much sense, and I hadn't thought of it that way when it came to looking for work. That actually, although I have thought of it as dating, that thing of it's also like the foundation of, a sustainable relationship going forward through all the ups and downs that may happen. And yeah, who it is that you want to be working with. I did once break up with a job. The manager, she was too distraught, I thought, that I was leaving. And she was like, but tell me why? Why? What can we do? And I just went, it's not you, it's me. I thought I could commit, but really I need to be freelance again. It was very much like a breakup. But speaking of freelance, there is the question that came in is there any support, or, you know, if you're part of the gig economy, if you are self-employed, if you have your own business, are you just out there completely on your own?
There is support, but it's quite sparse, is what I would say. So it's well worth looking at. There's some really great charities out there who are providing support for people, kind of giving them guidance about work. And Macmillan, for example, I think they have a HR helpline. You can ask for support. And they've got lots and lots of resource for line managers, for employers and for employees. So you can get their packs of information. And then you might want to go to all the specific cancer charities for the sort of cancer that you have, because a lot of them now do look at work and have a web page dedicated to work and advice. And they can have support options where you can speak to people. You've got organisations like Maggie's. They will offer you support around work in various different amounts and types. So it's worthwhile just getting in contact with your local Maggie centre and seeing what's available. And if you are self-employed, you may well also be able to have support through Access to Work. So applying for support there, so you can get all sorts of different resources. You can get practical things like payment for cabs to and from your clients, for example, if you're travelling. You can get some mental health support through Access to Work. You can also get access to software to help you if you're having cognitive difficulties, for example. You can access software through the Access to Work pathway as well. So it is out there. You could come directly to companies like mine. You can get support directly. If you've taken out, for example, income protection. So if you're a one-man band, but you've thought actually somewhere along the line, income protection is really important to me, I want to make sure that I'm okay. And you may well have already been getting that. If you've been off work, the income protection may well have kicked in. But it's worthwhile asking your insurer if there's any support, any vocational rehabilitation support they can provide, finding it through that route as well. So it does exist. Use your friend Google and see what's out there. And sometimes in local areas, you can find the stuff going on locally that's worth plugging into as well.
And I think some of that is giving yourself permission. So I didn't go back to the same job that I was diagnosed with, that I laughed and cried on the phone to them. I ended up moving back to the UK and starting from scratch, feeling that I had to be able to do a job 100% just like normal before I would attempt to do it. And actually giving yourself the permission to look at things like Access to Work, to look for support, I think is actually a really important part of this, because I think sometimes we stand in our own way as well, kind of, again, putting so much pressure on ourselves to be 100% when we're not.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question to ask generally. How many of us ever feel 100%? Anyway, we don't really think about it because we don't have to think about it. But, there are times I've been at work when I've not been firing on all cylinders and I've not felt tip-top by any stretch. And I think we need to challenge that. I've got to be 100%, because what does it look like? Where's the benchmark for that? How do we even know we're there? And saying, actually, what am I able to do? What would be a good start? So focusing on the positive. I'm not a big one for positive or negative, because I feel like they could be the same side of the coin. So I like the grey in the middle. What could I do? What's possible? And where do I start? And start small. And then, in my world, we see work as a health outcome. But we also see work as part of the rehabilitation journey. So using work as a way of building up your strength and stamina, building up your cognitive capacity, building up your emotional resilience, and actually being in a workplace enables you to do that. And I think you can do a lot of prep before you get back to work. You can mimic the workplace. You can have your desk all set up. You can go and work for an hour in the morning, hour in the afternoon. You could just be Googling stuff, or you can be doing Sudoku on the computer. I don't know, something that you're connecting with the screen, or you can be lifting and carrying and doing things if you've got a more sort of physical related job. So you can build up your strength and stamina and cognitive capacity and think to yourself, right, I'm now ready to take that first toe back into work. And that's where a really lovely phased return to work plan comes in. Whether you're self-employed or you're employed, you can still, you know, it's harder when you're self-employed because you've got to wear two hats. You've got to wear the employer hat and you've got to wear the employee hat. So you've got to pretend you're your own line manager and say, nope, you've got to pace your activities and you need to be doing it like this. And here's my plan, and I'm going to stick to the plan. And not do that creep thing of like, oh, I'll just do half an hour more. Yeah. Because if you see work as part of that rehabilitation process, then you won't do that pushing. And you can kind of manage it slightly differently.
Oh, again, I just love and the way that you put that with the wearing two hats, because I think as someone, you know, that's been self-employed for a very long time, there is this drive. But actually, if you think about wearing two parts, it does mitigate some of that. And actually, again, what you said about thinking of it as health, that your work is part of the health of your life, and actually working up to it, but sustaining it, thinking about what you need when you're in it, is a much more nourishing way, rather than what's my value and I guess I can't do that perfectly, you know, or maybe I can, maybe I can't, but you've given me so much to think about. I love this. Thank you. So if someone's been listening and they're like, okay, where can I find out more about you and what you do, and whether their work maybe offers a scheme similar to this, where would they go to find out more?
They can find us at our website, so working2wellbeing.com. It's number 2, working2wellbeing.com.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this today. Like I said, you've given me so much to think about. And this is one of the things that we do at Shine, is really provide space for these conversations, because we know that actually thinking about going back to work can be quite lonely. It can feel quite isolating. Yes. You can have a really unique situation. You know, sometimes you can be employed by a company that only has 3 people, for example, or you're self-employed, or actually it's your own business. There needs to be space for these conversations. So check out shinecancersupport.org. There are meetups, there are online groups. There's so much going on. If you have a question for a podcast, if you have an idea for a podcast, get on there, reach out to me, and we will share your questions with someone like the lovely Julie Denning. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure. No worries. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you listening, and to Radio Facilities for sponsoring our podcast. Till next time. Bye.
Bye.
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Not your grandma's cancer show.